This is The Baseline, discussing the hot button topics of the NBA.
Welcome, everybody. You're tuned to The Baseline. Cali, Warren Shaw discussing the hot button topics of the NBA. Special edition of The Baseline NBA podcast. Team No Sleep in effect, and so is the NBA. Unbelievable news happening in the late hours of Monday evening. The big trade that is taking place with Blake Griffin being moved to the Detroit Pistons, and just so much stuff already happening as we start edging ourselves a little bit closer to NBA All-Star Weekend, trade deadline. I mean, it's just absolutely phenomenal, the movements that have already been taking place. And it's crazy. So let me go ahead and roll out the red carpet and maybe a nice warm blanket from a right-hand man, 50 grand, NBA aficionado, www.shawsports.net, Big Kahuna, PNC. My man Warren Shaw repping out of Fort Lauderdale, Florida. Holler back at me, Mr. Shaw. I just want to know, how bad is your cerebellum shook up on this one?
Yo, my dude, it's an insane time right now, I think, in the NBA. We thought the biggest fish that was probably going to be moved was going to be DeAndre Jordan, but things had some other plans, and team may end up getting moved instead. So I think, this is, prime time to jump in and discuss all the moving and shakings in the NBA, brother.
Why move fish when you can move a whale? I mean, because that's or an albatross. Like, it's just it's ridiculous. So clearly the focus of our show is going to be about this trade. Blake Griffin, Bryce Johnson, Willis Reed being moved to the Pistons for Avery Bradley, Tobias Harris, Boban Marjanovic, and a protected first round and a second round pick. So we're gonna get into that. That's definitely gonna be on the big topic of conversation and the drop. And then of the breakdown. And then on the drop, we certainly are going to address a lot of the concerns that have happened over the last week with regards to injuries. Biggest injury clearly is the loss of Boogie Cousins, who is having a all-star obvious type season and really elevated himself. Well, we're actually talking about the New Orleans Pelicans making their placement again in the Western Conference playoff picture, how this is going to impact. So much stuff that we got to get into. But once again, we appreciate you and yours for hopping on board with us, for tuning in. Be sure to get my man Shaw at Shaw Sports NBA, or get at me at GameFace Lee. The show's Twitter handle at NBA Baseline. Available on all the major platforms. You know where we are and you know how we roll. So we always expect you to download that platform. Give us a listen. Give us a rating. Give us a comment. And we always embrace the feedback, and we want to hear from you, man. We love to, you know what I'm saying? We love to listen to the people. And so this is exactly how we roll. This is the life force that puts us in the driver's seat of giving you the content you need to hear with reference to the NBA. You know how we do, and you know how we roll. It's time now for the breakdown. Time to break it down. To the bone gristle. Time now for the breakdown. Cali, Warren Shaw of the Baseline NBA podcast, and it's remarkable. This type of trade that we're talking about with reference to Blake Griffin is the kind of deal that usually is made at the midnight hour on trade deadline night, and the fact that it is happening about a week from the NBA, or 2 weeks basically from the NBA All-Star Weekend, from NBA trade deadline, Jaw, it boggles the mind, but it does speak volumes. One of a team's desperation to put themselves in a better position. And I don't know, maybe the word desperation isn't the right terminology to use when we're talking about the Detroit Pistons. You could also probably flip the script and say that the terminology desperation could be on the side of the Los Angeles Clippers, because it's very clear to me that Jerry West desperately wants to be rid of the Lob City era. And if there's any indication that this is happening, first Chris Paul and now Blake Griffin.
Right. There's so many angles, I think, to attack from this. And we'll start in LA from the point you just ended off on with. Again, the great Ramona Shelburne had kind of alluded to the fact that this is a massive shift for the LA Clippers. Massive in terms of they had to go in now and convince their owner, Steve Ballmer, who's been in there for a few years now, and obviously one of the more exuberant owners in the NBA, and convince him that it was time. And we're in a situation now where Chris Paul said he was going to leave, so they got whatever the haul they got from the Houston Rockets from him. but they re-upped on Blake Griffin just this past summer, and all the reports are is like they rolled out the red carpet in terms of selling him on potentially being Mr. Clipper and being a Clipper for life, et cetera, et cetera. And just a couple months ago, when the DeAndre rumors started, were discussed. I remember I bring up the point specifically. He's like, well, you don't know what promises and assurances were made to Blake Griffin when it comes to DeAndre Jordan. So if you trade quote unquote his best friend, and a guy who's been a pillar for them in the building process of the Clippers, how would Blake take that? Now they flipped the script completely and abandon all of those principles and move Blake first before DeAndre's even out of town. So to me, this signifies again the Clippers are going to be in a state of flux. And what's really interesting to me though about this too is something that I haven't heard too many of you talking about, but does Doc Rivers now want to be here? Is he going to be here, past this season? Remember, he left the Boston Celtics because he didn't want to be part of a rebuilding situation. So now it seems like he's right back to where he started, with a different management now. So you just really wonder where that puts him as well too. But again, to see Blake go away, in a trade of this magnitude, signifies that hey, they're starting over. Avery Bradley, Tobias Harris are nice basketball players. Bradley's contract is done at the end of this summer. So that he could stay there or not stay there, depending on how Doc and the company feels about him. But overall, this is just shaking up the entire NBA, and it makes you wonder that this is going to be an explosive trade season.
Well, you just threw a whole bunch of stuff out there, so let me try and see if I can, line everything up properly, so we can get through some of the points that you just mentioned, Shaw. We'll get to the players in a moment because I completely agree with you. I think that there's going to be some discussion on who's going to benefit from this particular move. But I want to get back to your point with reference to Doc Rivers because I think that this is a very important point. Um, I think that the writing was on the wall very clearly the moment that Jerry West came on board. Now, I'm not saying that it would have taken someone like Doc Rivers by surprise. Clearly, he recognized that he was on a truncated window of opportunity here. First, you come in, you're the president of basketball operations, and then within that time span, you lose that entitlement or that titleship, right? And you got a guy like Jerry West who has proven to do more with less and to do it smartly or more smarter than you. Doesn't take anything away from Doc Rivers as a head coach, but it certainly questions his commitment on both being a head coach and being the president of the basketball operations. And this has already been documented because he has made some very questionable moves in putting the roster that he thought was good enough to contend for a championship. Okay. The problem here is from that moment on, it wasn't a question of how long, it was just a question of when. And if you're telling me now that you want the Doc Rivers who was pre Boston Celtics, who, could take on all of these oddly formed rosters and make them at least marginally successful or whatever, that you're never going to get that Doc Rivers anymore. He's already tasted the spoils of success. He's already tasted what it's like to have veterans that want to play for him. This is not that kind of Doc Rivers. And to me, this was a clear signal that whatever Doc Rivers embraced about coming to Los Angeles, whatever he embraced about this whole Clipper nation and putting his imprint on trying to do something historic and changing the face of Clipper basketball in relation to the Los Angeles Lakers being the sister team and all of that stuff is completely shattered. It is completely gone. And it's not even just because of Blake Griffin. It's because of the move. It's because of what has transpired over the last 4 months of this season. And I think if you are Doc Rivers, you should not continue to mess around with this. You really need to start exploring your options and you need to move away from this because this is no longer your seed in the ground. This is Jerry West. And I can clearly see that Jerry West and him are not going to be vibing moving forward.
I think there's validity to that statement because again, as we just alluded to, he doesn't seem to be the rebuilding type at that stage of his career. Like how good is Doc Rivers overall in terms of player development? I mean, you can say in some instances he was a big part of some of Avery Bradley's success in Boston back there, but overall, like I'm having a hard time pointing to okay, well, who did Doc Rivers actually make better? In that system. So he needs established veterans. He needs established guys that he can try to reach and hopefully make a deep playoff run. I don't think this is a situation for him moving forward either. I just don't think there's been a lot of conversation about what that means for the Clippers right as of yet. But I think that time is coming, and we have to see what kind of the rest of the moves are going to be before maybe we can make a full assessment of that. Because again, if they decide that Tobias Harris, Avery Bradley are going to be pillars of their future, they get this pick from Cleveland. Sorry, this pick from Detroit. They get a mid lottery pick or late first round pick. Do they turn that into something as well too? Either way, you just know they're not done. Lou Williams, DeAndre Jordan are also going to be on the move too, which you would think signifies that Doc Rivers is also going to be on the move, whether at the end of this season or maybe even a little bit before.
All right, you're tuned to the Baseline. Callie Warren Shaw discussing the hot button topics of the NBA. Breakdown conversation. Blake Griffin, he's been moved to the Detroit Pistons for a swath of players and some very salty draft picks. Let's just put it like that. So the reason why I say salty, Shaw, is because look, if you're the Los Angeles Clippers, you're not completely selling me on the idea that all of this is completely replacing the aura that is, Blake Griffin. And you've already conceded to the fact that you don't even care if whether or not this Clippers team would possibly make the playoffs, okay? Or they won't even make the playoffs. But I will say this. I think that this is a great move for guys like Tobias Harris and maybe even Avery Bradley. Number one, Doc Rivers, reunites with someone that has an opportunity, to coach up again. And if there's anybody that I really think deserves a good, solid paycheck, especially with the way that he plays defense and the way that he has improved his shot making ability, it would be someone like Avery Bradley. So I'm hoping that he continues he's going to certainly get his opportunity to thrive. I tend to wonder when guys like that go into certain systems, they get lost in that system, and they no longer become the kind of player that I think we hope and anticipate them to be as far as production goes. But for someone like Tobias Harris, I never thought that he fit with Detroit. I just never saw him being a Detroit Piston. His game to me is just too clean to be a Detroit Piston. I think that the best move possible goes to Tobias Harris. He's the one I think is gonna take advantage of this opportunity because his offensive game, I think, fits nicely with what LA Clippers fans, with the LA area. He's a sunshine boy. I feel like in some respects, the guy, he's from the East Coast, but to me, he's someone that looks like he could certainly do some damage out in the West Coast, and he has a demeanor that I think is palatable for other players to play around this guy. I don't think he's the kind of guy that's going to cause problems. I think Tobias Harris is going to be the winner out of this deal, man.
I think that's obviously a fair statement. He's gonna immediately come there, and be, I guess, option one really in the interim time. AB is going to have some opportunity as well too, as they still have some injuries. Also, Rivers isn't back yet, and again, it's still dependent on Lou Williams and DeAndre Jordan potentially being moved as well too. Lou Williams is option one now, with Blake out on until such time. But Harris is definitely going to have an opportunity to thrive. Gallinari potentially could be back this week, so they can play opposite of each other, 3 and 4. But I think Harris has had maybe a little bit more success as kind of a stretch for himself. So you wonder, also puts into play, okay, what's Gallinari's future going to be on this roster as well too? Like, there seems to be a lot of roster shakeup. To your point with Avery Bradley though, I wasn't sour on the move to Detroit so much. I mean, again, he was traded there, so Van Gundy and company wanted to get their KCP replacement, and I think everybody's a better player than Kentavious Caldwell-Pope by leaps and bounds, actually, especially from the defensive side of things. And things could have potentially worked there, because remember, the Pistons ran a lot of a lot of pick and roll previously, but this year they did a lot of dribble handoffs with Andre Drummond, and Avery Bradley has been making a living off of those, like, mid-range things. So I just envision Drummond, doing the dribble handoff to Bradley, coming off of like a little mini screen and being able to pop those mid-range jumpers. But it just didn't really happen for him this year. Camping out, they didn't have anybody to facilitate and get him the ball like Isaiah Thomas did last year. Dribble penetration, that didn't happen with Reggie Jackson at the beginning of this year, and Ish Smith has struggled as a starter. So Bradley should have seen a much better role on the LA Clippers now, especially reuniting with a former coach and Doc Rivers. And again, for as long as that's going to be the case, but I believe in Tobias Harris for sure taking leaps and bounds in terms of statistical production the rest of the season.
All right, so let's go ahead and shift our attention about what this means for the Detroit Pistons. The Detroit Pistons They look like a really good basketball team in the early part of this season. I mean, we haven't even, gotten to All-Star break. So there's still a lot of basketball left to be played. But again, this is the same basketball team that when they go through their lulls, um, they seem to be extended and excruciatingly painful if you're a Pistons fan. So I mentioned the word desperation earlier. And I sometimes feel like that when organizations make a play, it's either to make a splash or to create a typhoon. And in this particular case, I don't know where this lies because Blake Griffin, there's two things that you can look at this with regards to Blake Griffin and how this will affect the Detroit Pistons. You can upset the apple cart, but you can assume that a guy like Blake Griffin understands that, how this is going to impact him and he's going to play the good soldier. And then you got core guys like Andre Drummond, Tolliver, veteran type of guy. You got Reggie Jackson and these folks. They can help balance things out for Blake Griffin, making the transition easier for him. Or you can assume that this is exactly the kind of shakeup that this basketball team needs in order to spark whether it's a short-term run or maybe a possible long-term run. I'm on the fence about what this is because of the type of player that they're getting in Blake Griffin. He's markedly going to be your offensive player, right? He's your number one option. His reliability is going to always be in question because he's always a health risk. But I just wonder about that combination with him and Andre Drummond. Um, Certainly to me, the dynamic of Blake Griffin makes it, I think, a little bit easier for a guy like Andre Drummond. But I just wonder how a guy like Van Gundy is going to make it work, especially when I think, again, the biggest indictment to the Detroit Pistons' ability to stay as a force in the Eastern Conference is more their backcourt play than I think it would ever was their front court play.
Yeah, well, I don't know about force. I mean, they're ninth in the East, and I think this move does reek of desperation on multiple fronts. All reports, not all reports, but many reports out there are concluding to the fact that this Blake trade wasn't just about a push in getting into the playoffs and trying to be competitive in the Eastern Conference that people think is up for grabs, but more so the fact that the Pistons, with their new arena and Blake's overall popularity, that he'd be able to sell some tickets and put some butts in seats. Really, at the end of the day, so this is as much a basketball decision, I think, for the Detroit Pistons as it is a entertainment decision, if you will. A quality a quality assurance decision because they want to bring more people to their games and be more attractive in the open market. I think the
So
easy
wait, so Sean, let me just ask you this question. So you have a guy like a Stan Van Gundy, who's really always been an X's and O's type of guy. So in the way you're estimating this, this might not be so much of a surprise that Stan Van Gundy might lean in that kind of way, or is it more about him acquiescing to the organization, the upper management making this type of move or making this type of call to pull the trigger on something like this?
I mean, well, it checks two boxes, and that's what it boils down to. I think he can only be on board with a move like that if it does both of those things. So, um, again, you trade two quality players and you're giving up protected first round picks. You better be getting back somebody who is of a high quality and level. And Blake Griffin is an all star, all NBA type talent when he's right. So I think for them, it really does speak to the fact that again they want to sell more seats and more tickets rather, but they also want to remain competitive and feel like they may have an opportunity to do so with Blake and Andre Drummond together. And I think the easy comparison is Andre has a lot of similarities to DeAndre in some modes too. So okay, well those two bigs can play together. Blake knows what it's like to play with another big. Andre Drummond does not, though, on the other side of things. So that's where you kind of have to wonder what happens now. And as I alluded to a little bit earlier in the show, in terms of the offense, where a lot of stuff was going through Drummond as a lighthouse and in dribble handoffs and situations at the free throw line extended. Now Blake is a guy who's coming and dribbling up the ball sometimes himself, sometimes even active in pick and roll as the ball handler, not as even as the roll man. So what does that now look like for Van Gundy? The offenses are completely different in Detroit and LA, like completely different. So Blake has a lot of adjustments to do, as well as Andre Drummond's going to have to do if the ball is going to be taken out of his hands a little bit. But the Pistons, they want to remain competitive. I don't think they're done either. They also got a trade exemption from this move as well too. I think roughly in the neighborhood of about $7 million. So they'll probably use that to try to figure out a way to maybe improve their wing situation. But if you're Luke Kennard, Reggie Bullock, and even Stanley Johnson, here's an opportunity for you now to kind of really show what you're made of, because they're definitely going to need some more wing help outside of what the great backcourt now that Blake Griffin and Andre Drummond are forming.
All right, Shaw, before we go ahead and kind of round out this conversation that we're having with reference to this trade, how does this really look in the eyes of a guy like Stan Van Gundy? Yeah, I was reading an interesting article from SB Nation, who, these guys they made sure that they put their imprint on this particular deal, and it's a really good read. So I would, advise anybody to go to www.sbnation.com. And just look up Blake Griffin trade, and they point out certain things that you could take away from what this deal could actually mean. And they actually brought up a very interesting point with relation to Stan Van Gundy and the moves that have been made. On paper, you look at some of the deals that the Detroit Pistons have made since Stan Van Gundy has become, executive and also head coach for the Detroit Pistons. DJ Augustine and Kyle Sigler for Reggie Jackson, right? Getting Tobias Harris for Ersan Ilyasova and Brandon Jennings. When you look at these deals, man, on paper, these are solid deals. Like, these are deals that we would be talking about like, we should be talking about Stan Van Gundy being possible executive of the year with these kind of moves, right? Because these are quality players at the time that they were available that they made to put on this roster. But they've not panned out. They've not panned out. And you begin to wonder, like a poker player, when it seems like it's not you losing to a Phil Ivey that rakes your coals. It's losing to that dude who probably plays online like once a week and suddenly had the best hand that robbed you of the glory of winning the World Series of Poker Championship. Like, how much more, to the point we use that word desperation, will deals like this begin to hurt the reputation that Stan Van Gundy, I think, was trying to establish as being a sound executive who can make these kind of moves without us kind of looking at the Pistons and him sideways about the idea that these are just not really good moves?
Well, he's going to tinker. And, and I think in his role, he has the ability to do exactly that and try to figure out what's the best move for his roster and his team with management's approval. So I don't know how much we are going to and are going to continue to evaluate what he does in Detroit in that mode. Like, I think he's done an okay job. The roster hasn't been amazing. Some moves haven't panned out exactly the way that they wanted to. But he's continuing to evolve and change. And I think maybe that could be what his saving grace is. He's not beating his head against the wall like some coaches would be and say, okay, I'm just going to continue to do this. We all know he came to Detroit trying to build the roster the same way he built the Orlando Magic, or in that same mold. Then realized, okay, that's not necessarily going to work. Change a little bit, tinkered some more. And now, begin this year, started off great with a new offense and relenting on the pick and roll heavy isolation basketball. So I think for his standpoint, he understands the game is continuing to evolve. He's not stuck in his own way. But not everything is going to be a home run. Sometimes you just try to have to hit some singles, and this is a home run swing. With this Blake Griffin thing, like, this is definitely, hey, you know what? These singles weren't working out for me, so let me try this now. And I'll give him credit for that. But it is interesting that, again, things probably haven't worked out the way that he would have envisioned when he originally made some of those moves.
The resurgence of the fourth spot is back in the Central Division, Shaw. LeBron James, Giannis Antetokounmpo, and now Blake Griffin. Detroit Pistons, they sit 22-26 as we're recording this show, and on an 8-game losing streak. But I think we have just a little inkling. We're not Nostradamus or nothing. But if Blake Griffin brings the kind of game that he's capable of bringing, which I'm sure will put a smile on Stan Van Gundy's face, that losing streak may come to a very abrupt end, and the Detroit Pistons may actually find themselves trying to compete for an opportunity to play in the playoffs for this season. You're tuned to The Baseline. Cal Lee, Warren Shaw, discussing the hot button topics of the NBA, and this was The Breakdown. Time now for The Drop. Cal Lee, Warren Shaw, The Baseline NBA podcast. So much happening, Shaw. It's probably aptly great that we have this name, the drop, because it just seems like all of the star players, or at least quality players right now that we've been following this season, are dropping like flies. Like, just absolutely amazing. The injury with DeMarcus Cousins, Boogie Cousins rupturing his Achilles, just a tough blow if you are the New Orleans Pelicans. And it raises a lot of questions about what's this going to mean for the franchise moving forward. Um, I don't know how effective this basketball team was going to be for this season. I mean, I know everyone is still always pointing to the Golden State Warriors and the Houston Rockets as being, the teams of the West. But I was really looking forward to the idea that if Alvin Gentry could get this combination, which it seems like he was getting this combination of Davis and Cousins to be at full tilt, these guys could certainly introduce a methodology and a way of beating teams like the Warriors, or the Rockets, or at least being able to compete with those guys. And to see one half of the Twin Towers, the Twin Towers 2.0, basically, to me, it's heartbreaking, it's gut wrenching, and once again, it's just like this dumb luck for the Pelicans fan base.
Yeah, well, it sucks, man. We make no bones about it. Or at least I do. I'm a Boogie Cousins fan, and he's one of my
Yes, we all
favorite
know
players
about
in
your
the
man
NBA.
crush for the Boogie, man.
And unfortunately, to see him go down this way in what would ordinarily be an MVP like type season, definitely All NBA, definitely All Star. That's crushing. And to me, the Pelicans are in the mode. They don't play nearly in the same way, but they're like the Milwaukee Bucks in terms of nobody was really going to be excited to play them in the playoffs. Not saying that they're going to win, but you knew they were going to be one tough as hell out. Cousins and AD were making it work together as a tandem. You listen to all reports too that Cousins was extremely happy in his situation there. And now this kind of just makes us take a sharp left turn. You don't know whether that's going to stay on the road or it's going to go off the cliff right now because he's in a contract year. So what happens now if he has, a 10 to 12 month recovery? Do the Pelicans give him that max deal? Does he go elsewhere because they don't give it to him? Does somebody else even offer it to him? To me, I think you invest in this guy, but there's all this data that shows, like, especially for big men, and Cousins is one of the most unique big men, in the NBA today. That they don't really come back from Achilles injuries. The Elton Brand comparison was brought up multiple times over the weekend, and that makes you sad. You know what I mean? Elton Brand was a very good basketball player, and he never really recovered from that ruptured Achilles when he had it. Roughly, I think at the exact same age. Again, Cousins is a different breed. Medical technology is also different, even from what it was 5-10 years ago. And you would hope that he can come back and be the same force he has been. But this really puts into question what the Pelicans are going to do, what he wants to do, and how he wants to be treated as a guy who's coming off a significant injury, although he's an MVP type player.
I wonder though, Shaw, like, what does this mean for Alvin Gentry? Um, Look, again, I was never sold on Alvin Gentry being, the head coach. I think he's a
Yes, we
more
know you
than
love we know you don't like
he's a
Alvin Gentry.
more than adequate assistant head coach, man. And again, I don't
But he
not
was making this work, though. I mean, this was working. Six in the West, and the West is tough. And they were just kind of getting their sea legs underneath them with both these guys playing at the top of their game, and even Drew Holiday playing great basketball at the two. So I mean, and now we'll never know.
But I
So
think
that makes it
again,
hard.
Shaw, I think I listen, I give you that, right? I always feel like in this time frame, right, over the last 10 years, the exception to the rule of what we're talking about has been Dwayne Casey. I was not sold on Dwayne Casey being the head coach long term for the Toronto Raptors. But then I started seeing the effect that he had on certain players that I thought were marginal players. Like, I don't know if whether or not I would have ever seen the best out of Kyle Lowry until I saw him playing under Dwayne Casey. And then I began to buy into what Casey was actually trying to get from some of these guys. And I feel like with Alvin Gentry, he has had numerous opportunities, not just as a head coach, but even as an interim head coach. And I kept saying to myself, like, what is this thing about Alvin Gentry that's going to help get this Pelicans team over the top? Because oftentimes we accredit some of the success to head coaches because of the talent that they have the opportunity to mess with, right? And he's had Drew Holiday. He's had Anthony Davis. So you now suddenly tell me that by getting Boogie Cousins, it all of a sudden clicks. I'm just saying that I feel bad because again, this is not his. This is not his fault. It's not on him. And I completely agree with you. If you're Alvin Gentry, this really sucks because if you're getting these guys in their stride. But I do begin to wonder because we're talking about the Pelicans and because we talk about them doing desperate things at times, could they move Gentry because of this, or they give him a mulligan because of what happened to Boogie Cousins?
Yeah, I don't know if he's going to get a mulligan. It just might be one of those situations where, hey man, tough cookies. It's a wrap for you.
Right. Like it's not like they haven't done this before. They did it to Monty Williams. That's the reason why I'm saying, I'm afraid that even if at the very good that I see what Alvin Gentry is getting from these guys, and I don't know if whether or not that meant he suddenly has turned a corner and he's now raised his coaching acumen to a level that we're talking about a guy like Dwayne Casey like. I'm just saying that I feel bad because, again, the dumb luck is not just profoundly happened to basketball players. It's going to happen to this head coach because I just don't know if the Pelicans are going to buy into Gentry being the head coach after they're going to shell out this much money for a Boogie Cousins and do what they can to try to keep Anthony Davis.
Well, I mean, Davis is locked up for a while, so they don't have to worry about him so much. But yeah, the cousin situation is problematic. And I think a lot of what Gentry is going to be potentially evaluated on is what they do at the trade deadline. And all reports, again, especially from Woj, is saying that they're still going to be active. They were going to be active with Cousins or without him. They need to shore up that wing position. I've been banging the drum is like, hey, there's a guy that's available for them. And Rodney Hood. Again, Rodney Hood's always injured as well too, but they need somebody to go on that wing position. Ironically, in some ways, Tyreke Evans, who they let go last year, maybe could have been somebody that they could have still been using on this roster. Solomon Hill is due to come back, I think maybe around All-Star or just after. So they still have some a light, I guess, if you will, to some degree in terms of what they're trying to do, but they're still going to be active. And it's not just Gentry; it's Dell Demps in the front office as well too. I think the mandate for sure was that they needed to make the playoffs, and they were well on the way to doing so. But now, how does that shift? From an ownership standpoint, like you said, do they all get mulligans? Like, oh man, well, we were right there, and we probably would have made the playoffs and made some noise had Cousins stay healthy. But now, if they still say, well, what, we're still going to go for it and compete, and they shell out some money or trade draft picks, which would be a terrible idea if they did, but they may move some pieces around to try to stay competitive this year, then I don't know that Demps and Alvin Gentry will not be harshly evaluated if they don't make the playoffs.
All right, Shaw. Let's go ahead and focus our attention on Andre Roberson and the injury that he suffered. He's ruptured his patella tendon, so he's done for the season. And I can't believe that I'm even saying this because if there was an injury to Carmelo Anthony, Paul George, or Russell Westbrook, we would have basically said season's done. This experiment, absolutely, there's no getting around the fact that, there's no way that they're going to be able to get out of this or come out of this, looking good. It's just basically a first round catastrophe. But it's interesting. We may actually even be saying that about a guy like Andre Roberson and the kind of effect that he's going to have on this Oklahoma City roster. The fact that he is going down to injury and it's going to be gone for the year. I think it says and may even expose a lot of things about the fragility of this basketball team, which has been predicated on the star power of Paul George and Carmelo Anthony pairing up with Russell Westbrook.
Yeah, I think that's a fair assessment. Roberson is massive to what they do defensively. This is a fourth ranked defensive team in the NBA. And it's not just what Andre did, but Paul George as well too, obviously on the wing, and Steven Adams even in the middle. But this is a huge hit, and now here's a situation where they don't have a lot of rookies or a lot of youth on that team. It's really now it's a matter of whether Abrinas is going to come in here, which is primarily an offensive move, or whether the rookie Terrence Ferguson gets an opportunity now to kind of showcase his skills and see what he can do on the wing as well. Those are pretty much the options. So Sam Presti isn't necessarily going to sit on his laurels. Maybe he goes out there now and is aggressive. Is there a guy available that can fill a Roberson type of role? I look at Sacramento and a guy like Garrett Temple. And maybe that's somebody they go after, in a smaller move to kind of, shore up their wing defense, and a guy who can still is more effective offensively. Again, maybe not the same defender, but definitely can help them on both sides of the basketball. Those are the types of people that are available, I think, for them. And you just never know what happens. Like if like Iman Shumpert gets moved in some sort of deal and then it gets bought out, I think they'll be able to fill that position. I don't think they're going to stand pat and just let that go to the wayside and let Abrinas and and Ferguson just be those guys there. I think they're going to probably make some other move that they can do that won't affect them too much from a salary cap standpoint.
What are you seeing from this Thunder team though that's giving you optimism that they can get past this with Andre Roberson going down? I mean,
Well,
do you see a significant shift in the responsibility sake of defensive? Like I get it, we still rely on the fact that Paul George is still a great two-way player, albeit from a defensive perspective, I think he's been more worried about his offensive game more so than he's been worried about his defensive game. But look, if you have the defensive skills, those don't completely go away from you. But can they aptly recover losing a guy like Roberson, who I think was the glue to keeping everybody pretty even keeled until they all figured out their offensive games, that they can still play some level of defense, especially as they continue to move forward past the All-Star break and heading down the stretch of for this playoff run.
Yeah, I think they're gonna rely on each other. Their overall defensive principles. And again, it's an unfortunate situation, I think, for them. For specifically on that side of the basketball, but it is going to give them an opportunity to develop some young guys, to maybe for some other guys, in terms of changing their defensive philosophy somewhat, and just being more accountable on that side. So I think it can bring them together as a unit in some ways. But like I said earlier, I just don't think they're gonna let it ride. I feel like a smaller move is going to be made, and we're going to be, oh, that was pretty obvious. Like that's not a bad thing. There are a ton of 3 and D type guys available, whether that be via trade or even in the D League, that they could potentially call up and can potentially make a big impact for them on that side. So again, I'm not diminishing what Robertson does for them in any way, shape, or form. I just feel like they can get past it if they do a smart move. And other guys kind of just pick up the slack a little bit.
All right, Shaw. Let's go ahead and round out our drop conversation with another major injury news. With reference to Mike Conley and the Memphis Grizzlies. It's expected that he's going to have season-ending heel surgery, his left heel. There's a small bone protrusion, and so he's going to be gone for the rest of the year. Albeit he hasn't played since November the 13th. Um, I want to flip the script a little bit, and I don't want you to start with how this is affecting the Memphis Grizzlies. I think we're going to get to that point. I'm just curious about you, Shaw. This is a guy who got a $200 million deal, essentially, right? He was the highest paid a player, got the contract this past season from the Memphis Grizzlies. What is this saying about Mike Conley? Because my concern is the fact that this guy gets this major deal, and listen, he definitely deserved a lot of money. He's been a quality guard, and if you're the Memphis Grizzlies, essentially a cornerstone player for them. But this kind of injury, again, with him being as injury prone as he's been, this doesn't look this doesn't look good for Mike Conley. It's almost kind of like, hey man, I'm getting paid, and so hey, it is what it is. And here you got a team that's languishing, Memphis. Does this look good to Mike Conley?
It doesn't, but I think he has one saving grace here with this situation with the Grizzlies this year, is that they are piss poor. They have no chance of competing, and it just doesn't really make any sense for him to come back. So the Grizzlies are pretty much told him, go ahead and do this, because I think he could have came back this year, but they're just going to go ahead and shut him down, and continue to tank and try to get a relative draft pick and maybe solve some other pieces as well too, so that they can try again next year. They are invested in Conley, in terms of his ability to lead their team, but as a staple of the Memphis community alongside Marc Gasol. And until they're not, like I said, the same thing we said earlier about Blake Griffin in the show earlier. But there's always, sometimes there's a change. His contract is massive, one of the top 3 contracts in the NBA in terms of in terms of overall salary per year. So yeah, that's going to be hard to move if they were going to try to do that. So they almost by default have to be invested in him. He's not transcendent like Blake Griffin in terms of a guy who can sell tickets and be exciting and help you win. Conley's Conley. He's a good basketball player, but he's gone from underrated in some people's minds to just overpaid, as maybe alluded to. But I think for him, he could have came back. The organization decided it wasn't in their best interest to have him come back this year. But you do, from the Memphis standpoint, Now you have two albatrosses of contracts of two guys who barely play basketball, and Mike Conley and Chandler Parsons. So that's where the management is really up shit's creek here, because they have not managed their roster well, in terms of the salaries that they've been shelling out to some of these players.
And so you go ahead and led right into my point. If you're the Memphis Grizzlies now, what should you be doing? Um, I mean, obviously the intent is that people need a clear direction about what this basketball team needs to be like. And I'm sure if you are paying someone over 200 plus $1 million, like in Mike Conley, even though he is not on the basketball court, he'd like to get an inclination of what this team is supposed to look like, especially if he is going to be a centerpiece to it. What are you doing if you're the Memphis Grizzlies at this point?
Yeah, it's time to sell, sell, sell. And again, Tyreke Evans should not be on this roster come February 8th. He should be gone. And because he has some value right now, especially only $3.2 million and playing so well. Somebody will make a move for him. So they got to make that happen. They have a bunch of expirings, but the fact that 30 million is tied up to Conley next year, 24 to Parsons, and 24 again.
But if you're the Memphis Grizzlies, Shaw, just play GM for me real quick. If you're the Memphis Grizzlies, are you trading for assets or are you trading for picks?
You're trading. I think what you can get with what you're trying to sell off is you're trying to get picks or a combination of both. Really, Evans can potentially maybe get you a late first rounder or second rounder from somebody, because again, he is only on a 1 year deal that expires at the end of the summer, at the end of this year. So people aren't going to invest in that. Gasol is your biggest trade piece, that people would still have interest in, even at his salary. But then again, you say that you're married to him as well too. But he's the person who can get you the biggest haul in terms of first round picks and assets together. So if I'm the Grizzlies, I truly am, just like how the Clippers gave up on Lob City. I'm giving up completely on Grind City, and letting this just go. And I think Gasol should be moved, but I don't think they are in the headspace to do that. I just don't see it from them. I wish they would prove me wrong in that situation, but Gasol is definitely the biggest piece that can help them start a rebuild and get on the right track faster.
All right, you're tuned to the Baseline. Callie, Warren Shaw discussing the hot button topics of the NBA. Our subject is the drop key injuries that have plagued the NBA over the last week or so. Certainly, it's changing the landscape, possibly even the playoff picture in the Western Conference, respectively. So, just kind of rounding this whole thought process off, Shaw. Uh, we clearly can see that the Boogie Cousins injury is going to be the one that's going to impact the most, because we're talking about a Pelicans basketball team that was right in the middle of things as far as the Western Conference playoff picture. But I am curious, though, Shaw, that what is it speaking about when we talk about the depth of talent that's out there? Is it somewhat of a worry when you recognize that even as good as a basketball team clearly is, when you have star players, that they don't have enough, to make up for the Boogie Cousins of the world, for the for the guys like the Mike Conleys, Andre Robersons. There's a few guys that are out there that I'm sure that you can make a play for. But if you're a guy like Boogie Cousins, if you're a guy like Mike Conley, clearly that role, that position that's being exposed, it's kind of hard. I'm not saying you got to have somebody that's got to replace those numbers, but you got to have bodies that are adequately involved to at least alleviate some of the burden that's going to fall on the shoulders of the guys like the Anthony Davises and the Drew Holidays, who have had to do that when they didn't have a Boogie Cousins, or if you're like a Mike Conley, when you didn't have, a Mark Gasol, a JaMychal Green, or, a Zebo on your roster. Why is it that we're seeing this lack of addressing depth when it comes to these rosters? And is this more so of the focus about what we're expecting now to happen come draft time, that some of these organizations have really got to start looking to fill the roster with quality guys that at least show signs that they're going to contribute when they come on this team?
Well, I think it's problematic in the case of New Orleans, because there's just not players like DeMarcus Cousins out there.
Yeah, I mean, he's a generational, type, almost generational type of player. The guy's skill set is off the chain. But it's just hard to imagine, like, when a team like the Pelicans lose someone like that, how badly it just absolutely. There are some teams, Shaw, that you can actually point to that once they lose a player, that is it. I mean, it is a wrap. and it'll probably be that way for another 3 to 5 years. I don't know if it's a curse or it's just this, this black cloud that just continues to hang over them all the time. And it sucks because it should not really have to be that way. And I'm not saying it's because you have to be a successful franchise. I'm just saying there's always a contingency on certain things to take place. And you can still be a solid basketball team. And I'll go back to our generation, the Orlando Magic. Look, remember when they threw out those 2 major deals to get Grant Hill and Tracy McGrady? The Magic was still a good basketball team when they didn't have Grant Hill. And it's clearly because they had Tracy McGrady, but they still had to compensate for not having that person play at the position that Grant Hill was expected to play. And they got at least something from that. And they were a competitive basketball team. It just never seems to play that way with teams like the Pelicans or the Grizzlies. You lose one player and it's just all the hell after that.
Well, I mean, I think there are 2 examples of organizations that have drafted poorly, or when they've made moves, given up picks that they don't even have the option to bring in the requisite young talent, and they are not free agent destinations by any stretch of the imagination, either one of those teams. So I think those are very unique examples because they're examples of teams that have done it wrong, especially in the case of Memphis, who've just crapped away draft pick after draft pick, and then when they actually have their picks, just haven't made good decisions, and players who haven't panned out. Here the oddity in all of this to me is in the case of New Orleans, well, they lucked into DeMarcus Cousins, catching a Sacramento team or a general management, if you will, that seemed to be off kilter, unprepared to really deal. And then more or less
you're saying that Vlade was on that Moscow mule a little bit too much.
Had to be, because there is no way that is what you get back for DeMarcus Cousins. And now if other teams were calling, do you think they could offer them a package of Buddy Hield and some whatever? Like, get out of here. So to me,
which to this day people still keep trying to mistake him for Buddy Lee. So
it's insane. So New Orleans lucked into that in terms of getting him to begin with. And that more or less kind of said, you know what? Well, this is our roster. Let's go ahead and do this. 2 25+ point per game guys on the same team. 2 10+ rebound guys on the same team. Like, that's madness for what they were able to do. And now it's unfortunate to see that go away for the rest of this season. And I really do hope that he does stay. The great Joe Myers, one of the announcers for the New Orleans franchise, says the Cousins was in a great space in terms of being very close to his home in Alabama, 2 hours away in New Orleans there. And was really trying to figure something out. So hopefully he comes back strong, like I said earlier, and is right there to lead this Pelicans franchise into the playoffs with Anthony Davis. But if not, there will be vultures swirling. I don't think Cousins is going to have go the way of Elton Brand. I just feel like he's going to come back stronger and still be very effective in this league for years to come.
All right. This has been an awesome show. Listen, man, we up with the Roosters, giving our input with reference to what's taking place over the last 24 hours. It's been a hellacious, time on the NBA Newswire, Shaw. So, once again, man, we have to do what we got to do, and hey, got to keep plugging away. But certainly there's no way that this particular news story breaks out and the Baseline boys don't give their input on it.
We had to do it, man. So I'm excited that things are happening in the way that they're happening, kind of catching everybody off sides. If you were like, yo, what's really good? And now I'm interested to see what happens with the rest of this trade deadline. I'm waiting for the DeAndre Lou Williams shoes to drop, even the Doc Rivers move, maybe potentially there. What do the Bucks do? What do the Cavs ultimately do? Like I said, things seem like, in essence, that they're really going to be happening. And hey, we're going to be right here to cover it all, man. So I think we may have to do another, trade deadline special on February 8th, man, and make sure that we give everybody the butt of goods, as you like to say, homie.
Most definitely. Once again, we'd like to thank you and yours for tuning in with us here. Callie, Warren, Shaw, Baseline NBA Podcast. We appreciate you guys. We do. And we'll catch up with you next time.